Welcome to this video about secondary port tidal height calculations. Before you watch it, it's really important that you watch the first one actually, because there's all sorts of stuff in there about tidal definitions and what it is we're really trying to fettle out of the tables. So if you haven't watched that one, watch it now and then come on to this one. Most important to get them both together. It's a bit like astronavigation really. I always say to people, when you're reading my book about astro, don't go on to page 2 till you've cracked page 1, and that's how it is with this video. Now we're going to have some fun. It's time for secondary ports. There's an awful lot of ports in Northern Europe, and most of them have slightly different tides from the one next door and very different tides from the one over the other side of the country. If each one of them had a full set of tide tables like we were looking at for Liverpool, it would fill, well, it would fill a library, it would fill my study with books. And that's no good because nobody wants to buy all those books, and anyway they'd get in the way. So the way it's dealt with is this. The tidal system is built on standard ports. These are main ports where big ships go very often, and they have full tide tables set out in the almanac, and there aren't so many of them that you can't get them all in an almanac, so that's good. Now then, what about the secondary ports? Well, they don't have pages of tide tables. You may be able to get some tide tables from a local harbour master if you pay him a few bob or buy him a pint, but they're not in the almanacs, they're not in the general purpose books. Instead, they have their own little page, or their own little quarter of a page, or maybe just on a list, and against their name will be a series of numbers, and these numbers relate them to the standard port to which they are attached. They are called tidal differences, and they are quite literally what they say they are. They're the difference in tide between what we're looking at, the little port we're looking at, and the standard port to which it refers. Now, working out how to do the whole tidal situation as we did with Liverpool for these secondary ports is it's a bit of a challenge for some people, and all sorts of methods have been produced by cleverer men than me for doing it. But I have found that the best way to deal with it is just to use good old-fashioned mental arithmetic like we all learned at school. I think I could have done these sums when I was 10, and I wasn't very bright at arithmetic. I had to have 2 goes between you and me before I could get a good enough mark to get into university to read something different altogether. But we all had to have maths in those days, and it took me 2 tries. So don't imagine that I'm sort of numeric genius. I'm absolutely not. But these things are just basically logical. So that's the way we're going to attack this. And we're going to have a look now at my almanac, and we're going to have a look at the tides for Beaumaris, which is on the Menai Straits up in North Wales, and the standard port for that is Holyhead. So, I think the only thing to do is bite the bullet, plunge in and see how we're going to do it. Here we go. I've found myself a suitable secondary port in the almanac. I'm going to use Beaumaris on the Menai Strait. I used to sail dinghies there when I was a student. Now then, when we look at the page in the almanac, it's easy enough to find Beaumaris because as you move around the coast, the ports come up in a logical way. If you're not sure, you can always go into the index and it'll give you page and chapter and verse, so you can easily find it. So when we find Beaumaris, we find that there is no big page of tides like there is for Liverpool. All there is this bit of information here. Okay, that's no worries. What we want to know, therefore, because it's obviously a secondary port, is what its standard port is, and it's Holyhead, look. It tells us that right up at the top, and it's even good enough to tell us that we have to go right in the book to find it. Oh, you can't beat that, can you, for service? So away we go, and here's the page for Holyhead, just 2 pages on. We've got to choose a suitable day now for our calculation, and I think we'll go for March the 21st. Why not? Looks a good day to me. So I've prepared a little table here that will enable me to keep tabs on what I'm doing. And I always do it like this because I've found that this works. It's dead easy. You don't need to have anything printed out or anything. You can just rattle this off in the bottom of your logbook or on a piece of old paper. And what I'm going to write down is the time and height of high and low water Holyhead in this top box here. So March the 21st, I see that high water is 0853. 0853, and the height is 5 meters. 5.0 meters. Low water, coming up later, is at 1508. And its height is 1.3 meters. Okay, that's done. So now we've got to look into the question of the differences at Beaumaris, and we want to take the paper onto one side for a moment. We'll go back to our Beaumaris page and we'll see how that's looking. Pretty good here. So, tidal differences Beaumaris. Now this is where it gets interesting. People find this a bit of a challenge, but it's perfectly logical when you look at it. Suppose high water was at, where are we? 0853. Suppose that it was at 0600. Well, the tidal differences would be plus 10 minutes on Holyhead. That means you have to add 10 minutes to the time of Holyhead if high water's at 6 o'clock. It's unfortunate that nature has arranged things so that the tidal differences isn't the same all the way round, but unfortunately that's the way it is, and it's different at Springs and Neeps. So if the tide happens to be high at 12 o'clock, then it's 25 minutes you have to add to Holyhead. But you see, getting between these two is not at all difficult, because 0600 it's 10 minutes, at 1200 it's 25 minutes. So it moves 15 minutes between 600 and 1200, which means, well, there's 6 hours there, isn't there? And 15 minutes. So it's moving 6s into 15 is 2.5. It's moving 2.5 minutes each hour from this figure towards this figure between 6 o'clock and 12 o'clock. Well, the time we're interested in is 0853. I think for tidal differences purposes, we can call this 9 o'clock. 0900. So it's actually halfway between 0600 and that. Or you could say 3 hours after that one. We're going 2.5 minutes an hour, so 3 times 2.5 is 7.5, so it's plus 17.5 minutes, isn't it? You get that? 2.5 minutes an hour between there and there. We're at 9 o'clock, so we're 3 minutes after that, so we add 7.5 minutes to this figure. And we can double check we've done it right, because it should be moving towards this figure, and 17.5 is moving towards that, so that's correct. So the tidal difference on time is 17.5 minutes plus for high water. The same thing works for low water. Our time is 1508. Well, we'll call it 1500 because that's the nearest thing. At 1100, the tidal difference is plus 35 minutes. At 1700, it's 55 minutes. So there's 20 minutes difference between the two, and it takes 6 hours to work it out. So what's 6 is into 20? Well, 3 6s are 18. So it's 3 minutes and about 3.5 minutes an hour, isn't it? So 3.5 minutes an hour, it's advancing from plus 35 to plus 55, and it's 1500 that we're interested in. So it's 4 hours on from that. 4 hours times 3.5 minutes is 4 3s are 12 and 4 hours 14. So we're going to add 14 minutes to that, and we're going to get 0049. So we add 49 minutes. We know that's right because it's on the way from that to that. So that's good. So we've done that. We've done the time. Now what about the height? Beaumaris time height difference. Mean high water springs is 2 meters. So we've got 0.4 difference between Springs and Neeps. Well, our height is 5 meters. So if Neeps is 4.4 and Springs is 5.6, that's 1.2 meters between the two. At 5 meters, we're 6 down, 0.6 down. So we're literally halfway between the two, aren't we? We're on a mean tide halfway between Springs and Neeps. We can do that by inspection. Our height, look, is 5 meters. Springs is 5.6, Neeps is 4.4, so we're halfway. So there we are. So we're halfway between the two. We'll write that in our little box. And at the other end of the scale, we know now that we're halfway between the two. Low water's +1 or +5. Difference is 0.4. So our figure is going to be plus 0.3, halfway between those two. And it's plus. Don't forget that it'll give you a plus, or sometimes it's a minus. In our case, it's a plus. So all we have to do now to see what the time is at Beaumaris is just complete my little table, and it goes like this. So the time is 08:53 plus 17.5. Oh dear. 7 and 3 is 10. 10.5. Carry 1. 5, 1 is 6 and 1 is 7. Well, we're talking minutes, so we can't have 7, so it's 10. And it's 09, 10.5. That's right, isn't it? Yeah, 09, 10.5. And the height is 7.8 meters. The low water, this was plus as well. The low water is 1557, and the height is 1.6. And that's it, really. That's the time and height of high water at Beaumaris. 09, 10.5, call it 09, 10, and it's 7.8 meters high. 1557, 1.6. And those are the figures with which we enter the Holyhead timetable to work out our intermediate tides. Their Lordships at the Admiralty do not give us a tidal height curve for every secondary port, for the same reason that they don't give us a table for it. There's just no room. So we use the tidal height curve for the standard port, which is Holyhead. And we use it in the same way that we did before, except that we enter it with the numbers that we've worked out for Beaumaris. And we've got a low water height of 1.6 meters. So we make a little mark here. And we've got a high water height of 7.8 meters, which is here. Now, to use this table successfully, as we've already discovered with Liverpool, but we're going to do it one more time for Auld Lang Syne, we're going to join these two dots carefully as we can. You'll have to bear with me because it's a bit tricky doing this for the camera. There we are. We draw a line between them, and we note the time of high water at Beaumaris, and it's 0910. So we write 0910 in here. Now let's suppose we want to know what the height's going to be 2 hours after high water at 10 past 11. We move across here, high water 10 past 10, 10 past 11. We go up here until we find our place on the curve. There it is. We construct a line across the page from there until it gets to our tide line. And where it meets the tide line, we go up to the tide heights, and there is our answer. And it's 6.1 meters. So 2 hours after 9:10, there's going to be 6.1 meters of tide up. If we want to know what time, there's going to be 4 meters of tide up. We start at 4 meters, come down to the line, go across to our tidal height curve, and drop a line down to the times. And there we are, 3.5 hours after high water. So there you are. Isn't that wonderful? Remember, these are all tidal predictions. If you point one out, I wouldn't get too incensed about that, quite honestly, and not too worried about half minutes or 2 minutes here, 2 minutes there, because the moon's pushing this stuff around. If the weather's not quite as the people who do the calculations would like it to be, it'll move the time of the tide a little bit, one way or the other. So long as you're nearly there, that's going to do it. And that's the way you work out a secondary port tidal height calculation. There's just one final thing to mention about secondary ports, and that is that in certain areas, notably the Isle of Wight and the Solent, where there's an awful lot of sailing goes on, the tides behave in a very eccentric manner. The tidal streams swirl around the island and they tend to pile up, and the result is that we get too high waters very often. Nobody can be absolutely sure when the high water is going to be, and so rather than running the tidal curve
from high water, as we do for ordinary ports, we run it from low water, because for some reason low water in the Solent is a lot easier to predict than high water. And here it is. This is a typical example. There are half a dozen of these curves depending on where you are. This particular one's for Buckler's Hard, which was my home port for many years, and probably still is if I come back to England. And you'll notice some funny things happening here. You'll see that as we look at the tidal curve, we can see that the spring one, which is the full range, goes up and wiggles across like this before it piles in to fill up the full tide. That's called the young flood stand. The tide will flood into the river like a bandit for the first couple of hours, and then it slows right down. And in fact, that curve's not exactly right, because I've actually seen it stop completely for nearly 2 hours before it starts running in again. It then trundles in until you get right up to high water. It hangs around for a couple of hours at least, and then it suddenly, whoosh, out it goes and drops like a brick to low water. So you can read a lot into the tidal curve, and you plug in your information just as you normally would for any other tidal curve. You put your high water in and your low water in, you join the dots and move across to the tidal curve for the hours you want or for the height you want. But you just need to be aware of that. Don't think you're going to do it all on Portsmouth curve, because you're not. Anywhere between Poole and Chichester, you need to go into this page on your almanac and find out the right curve for the job. Before we leave the subject of calculating tidal heights, there's a really critical thing that's very often forgotten. All this material that you get out of the tables is predictions, and it's predicted on astronomical data. It's predicted on the movement of the moon and the sun and the earth. They know where that's all going, and they can do it very accurately, but it's only a prediction, because the water that's moving around is subject to other forces. The first one is weather. If it's blowing hard from the southwest in the Solent, where I used to keep my boat, I used to keep it in a mud berth, and we'd float up on high water and go sailing, and low water would be dried out in the mud. When there was a big southwest gale blowing in out of the Atlantic, and it had been blowing in the Atlantic for days in the winter, the tide would come up and up and up, and it would keep right on coming. And if it was a spring tide, it could end up 2 or 3 feet above the prediction. That's almost a metre above the prediction. It's just blown in by the wind, literally that. And if it's blowing from the northeast, where I used to keep my boat, it'll blow it away and you'll have less tide. And I can't tell you what it's going to do in your home waters. There's a certain amount of common sense. Ask around, see what happens. Keep your eye on the water, and after a few years, you'll know what it's going to do. In Denmark, where I keep my boat, there isn't really any tide to speak of, but the wind doesn't half blow the water around, and I've seen a tide a whole metre above, or rather the water level, a whole metre above where it should have been. Now then, there's something else, and this you can predict, and this is atmospheric pressure. It's literally the weight of the air sitting on the water. It all starts with standard pressure, which, depending on who you listen to, is about 1,013 millibars. I think we'll settle for that, 1,013 millibars. Now, every 30 millibars will move that by a foot. So if you've got a high pressure of 30 millibars above, so the pressure is 1,043, it will push the tide down literally a foot. Now then, by happy coincidence, a foot equals 30 centimetres. So 30 millibars shoves it down 30 centimetres. So it's a centimetre a millibar. And if it goes below standard pressure, it'll suck the water up just the same amount. A centimetre a millibar. Bear all that in mind. Calculate it as tightly as you can, and you won't go far wrong.